The courtroom was silent, the kind of silence that feels heavy, like the air itself is holding its breath. All eyes were fixed on the little girl, no older than 8, standing nervously in front of the judge's bench. Her tiny frame seemed even smaller under the weight of the baby she cradled in her arms. The baby, wrapped in a worn blanket, fussed softly, and the girl shushed it gently, her hands trembling. She looked out of place in the cold, formal setting, her wide eyes darting around the room as if searching for someone who wasn't there. The judge, a stern man with a reputation for being no-nonsense, leaned forward, his gaze sharp and unyielding. "Young lady," he began, his voice dripping with condescension, "do you even understand why you're here today?" The room seemed to freeze. Everyone knew this judge wasn't known for his patience, especially with children. But what happened next would leave everyone in that courtroom, and eventually the world, utterly speechless. The little girl, whose name was Emma, had been through more in her short life than most adults could imagine. She had been thrust into a world of responsibility far beyond her years, forced to grow up too fast. The baby in her arms wasn't just any baby. It was her baby brother, and she was all he had. Their parents were gone, lost to a tragedy that had left Emma and her brother alone in a system that didn't seem to care. Today, she was in court because of a bureaucratic mix-up, a cold and impersonal system that had failed to see her as anything more than a case number. But Emma wasn't just a case number. She was a fighter, a protector, and, as the judge was about to discover, a voice that would shake the very foundation of that courtroom. As the judge continued to question her, his tone growing more impatient, Emma's fear began to melt away, replaced by something else, something fierce. She straightened her shoulders, her small voice cutting through the tension like a knife. "I'm here because I love my brother," she said, her words clear and steady, "and I'll do whatever it takes to keep him safe." The room seemed to hold its breath. The judge, caught off guard, leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. But Emma wasn't done. What she said next would bring everyone in that courtroom to tears, including the judge himself. Her words would reveal a truth so raw, so heartbreaking, that it would change the course of that day and the lives of everyone who heard her story. But before she could finish, the judge raised his hand, silencing her. "Enough," he said, his voice softer now though still firm. "I've heard enough." The tension in the room was palpable. What would he do next? Would he dismiss her, sending her back into a system that had already failed her so many times? Or would her words reach him in a way no one expected? The answer would come, but not before the courtroom was left hanging on the edge of their seats, waiting to see how this little girl's courage would change everything. And as for Emma, she stood there, holding her brother tightly, her heart pounding but her resolve unshaken. She had already fought so hard. But the hardest part was yet to come. The judge's interruption hung in the air like a storm cloud, heavy and unpredictable. Emma's heart raced as she clutched her baby brother, closer, her small hands gripping the blanket wrapped around him. She could feel the eyes of everyone in the courtroom on her. Lawyers, social workers, even the bailiff who had given her a kind smile when she first walked in. But now, that smile was gone, replaced by a look of concern. The judge's stern face was unreadable, his sharp eyes studying her as if trying to piece together a puzzle. Emma knew she had to stay strong. She had to make him understand. But how could she when even the adults in her life had failed to listen? Emma's story wasn't one that could be easily summed up in a few sentences. It was a story of loss, of resilience, and of a love so fierce it defied her age. Just a year ago, her life had been completely different. She had lived in a small, cozy house with her parents and her baby brother, Lucas. Her father worked long hours as a truck driver, but he always made time for bedtime stories and weekend pancake breakfasts. Her mother, a nurse, was the heart of their home, always humming as she moved from room to room, making everything feel warm and safe. But all of that changed one rainy night when a car accident took both of her parents away. Emma remembered the police officer who came to the Yaoiji door, his hat in his hands, his face grim. She remembered the way her world had shattered into pieces that no one seemed able to put back together. After the accident, Emma and Lucas were sent to live with their aunt, a woman who had never been particularly close to the family. At first, Emma had hoped things would be okay, but it didn't take long for her to realize that her aunt saw them as a burden. The woman was cold and distant, more interested in the monthly checks she received for taking care of them than in actually caring for them. Emma quickly learned to take care of Lucas herself, feeding him, changing his diapers, rocking him to sleep when he cried. She became his protector, his mother, his everything. But it wasn't enough. One day, her aunt simply didn't come home. Days turned into weeks, and Emma and Lucas were left alone in the house with no food, no money, and no way to call for help. It was only when a neighbor noticed the silence and called the authorities that anyone realized what had happened. The system that was supposed to protect them had failed. Emma and Lucas were placed in foster care, but it was far from the safe haven they needed. The first home they were sent to was overcrowded, with too many children and too few adults to care for them. Emma did her best to shield Lucas from the chaos, but it was impossible. Nights were filled with the sounds of crying babies and arguing, teenagers, and days were a blur of uncertainty. The social workers who visited seemed overwhelmed, their faces tired and their words rushed. Emma tried to tell them how scared she was, how much she missed her parents, how much she just wanted a safe place for her and Lucas. But her words seemed to get lost in the shuffle, drowned out by the endless paperwork and bureaucratic red tape. And then came the day that brought her to this courtroom. Emma had been told they were going to meet someone who could help them, but instead she found herself standing in front of a judge who seemed more interested in getting through his docket than in listening to her. She had been so nervous, her stomach in knots, her hands shaking as she held Lucas. But when the judge had mocked her, something inside her had snapped. She wasn't just a little girl. She was a sister, a protector, a survivor. And she wasn't going to let anyone, not even a judge, make her feel small. Now, as the judge leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable, Emma braced herself for what would come next. Would he send her back to the foster home, where she and Lucas were just two more faces in a sea of forgotten children? Or would he finally see her, really see her, and understand that she wasn't just asking for help for herself, but for her brother, who depended on her for everything? The room was so quiet she could hear the ticking of the clock on the wall, each second stretching out like an eternity. The judge cleared his throat and Emma's breath caught in her chest. What would he say? What would he do? The tension was unbearable, and yet she knew this was only the beginning. The fight for her and Lucas's future was far from over. As the judge opened his mouth to speak, Emma's mind raced. She thought about her parents, about the love they had given her, and the strength they had taught her. She thought about Lucas, his tiny hand gripping her finger, his trusting eyes looking up at her. She thought about all the times she had been told she was too young, too small, too powerless to make a difference. But she wasn't powerless. Not anymore. Whatever the judge decided, she knew one thing for certain. She would never stop fighting for her brother. And as she stood there waiting for the judge's next words, she felt a spark of hope ignite deep inside her. Maybe, just maybe, someone would finally listen. The judge's voice broke the silence, but his words were not what anyone expected. "Young lady," he began, his tone softer now, though still carrying the weight of authority. "I need you to understand something. This courtroom is not a place for children to solve adult problems." Emma's heart sank, but she refused to let her shoulders slump. She held Lucas tighter, her small arms trembling under the weight of her responsibility. The judge leaned forward, his eyes narrowing slightly as he studied her. "But," he continued, "I'm willing to hear you. Out. Tell me in your own words why you're here today." Emma took a deep breath, her mind racing. This was her chance, her one chance, to make him see the truth. But before she could speak, a voice from the back of the courtroom interrupted. "Your Honor, if I may." It was a woman dressed in a sharp suit, her hair pulled back into a neat bun. She stepped forward, her heels clicking against the polished floor. "I'm Miss Carter, the Children's Court-appointed advocate. I'd like to request a brief recess to speak with my client." The judge raised an eyebrow, clearly annoyed by the interruption, but after a moment, he nodded. Very well, Will. Take a 15-minute recess. He banged his gavel and the room erupted into murmurs as people began to move about. Emma felt a hand on her shoulder and turned to see Ms. Carter kneeling beside her. Emma, the woman said gently, I know this is overwhelming, but I need you to trust me. Let's talk outside, okay? Emma hesitated, her eyes darting to the judge, who was already shuffling papers on his desk. She nodded reluctantly, allowing Ms. Carter to guide her and Lucas out of the courtroom and into a small, quiet hallway. The advocate crouched down to Emma's level, her expression kind but serious. Emma, I need you to tell me everything. Not just what's happened today, but everything that's led you here. Can you do that? Emma's throat felt tight, but she nodded again. She began to speak, her voice shaky at first, but growing stronger as she recounted the events of the past year. The accident, her aunt's abandonment, the chaos of the foster home. She told Ms. Carter about the nights she spent comforting Lucas, when he cried, the days she went without eating so he could have enough formula, the fear that never seemed to go away. As she spoke, Ms. Carter's expression shifted from concern to something deeper, something like determination. Emma, she said when the girl finally paused, you've been incredibly brave, but you shouldn't have to carry this alone. That's why I'm here, to help you. Meanwhile, back in the courtroom, the judge was deep in conversation with the bailiff. That girl, the judge muttered, more to himself than to anyone else. She's got a fire in her. Reminds me of my own daughter. The bailiff nodded, sensing the judge's internal struggle. Kids like her, the bailiff said carefully, they don't get dealt an easy hand, but sometimes all they need is one person to believe in them. The judge didn't respond, but his expression was thoughtful as he stared at the empty space where Emma had stood. Outside, Ms. Carter was already making plans. Emma, she said, I'm going to request that the judge grant us more time. We need to gather evidence, speak to witnesses, and make sure your voice is heard. But I need you to be strong a little longer. Can you do that? Emma looked down at Lucas, who was sleeping peacefully in her arms, his tiny chest rising and falling with each breath. She thought about all the times she had promised him she would keep him safe, no matter what. Yes, she said firmly, her voice steady. I can do that. When they returned to the courtroom, the tension was palpable. The judge looked up as they entered, his gaze lingering on Emma for a moment before he spoke. Ms. Carter, he said, I trust you've had a productive discussion. The advocate nodded. Your Honor, I'd like to formally request a continuance. My client's case requires further investigation, and I believe it's in the best interest of both children to ensure all facts are presented before any decisions are made. The judge leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled as he considered the request. The room seemed to hold its breath, waiting for his response. But before he could rule, a commotion erupted at the back of the courtroom. A man burst through the doors, his face flushed and his breathing ragged. Your Honor, he shouted, drawing gasps from the crowd. I have critical information regarding this case. The judge's eyes narrowed, and he banged his gavel to restore order. Approach the bench, he commanded, his voice sharp. The man hurried forward, clutching a folder stuffed with papers. As he began to speak in hushed tones, Emma's heart raced. Who was this man? What did he know? And how would it change? Everything? The judge's expression grew darker with each word the man spoke. Finally, he turned to Emma and Miss Carter, his face unreadable. It appears, he said slowly, that there are new developments in this case. We will reconvene tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock sharp. Until then, the children will remain in temporary custody. He banged his gavel again, and the room erupted into chaos. Emma felt Miss Carter's hand on her shoulder, guiding her out of the courtroom, but her mind was spinning. What had just happened? And what did it mean for her and Lucas? As they stepped into the hallway, Emma looked up at Miss Carter, her eyes filled with questions. The advocate gave her a reassuring smile, but there was a flicker of worry in her eyes. We'll figure this out, Emma, she said. But for now, you need to rest. Tomorrow is going to be a big day. Emma nodded, but her mind was already racing ahead. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but she knew one thing for certain. She wasn't going to let anyone take Lucas away from her, no matter what.